Ba 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 ba. Good day and welcome. I'm Joey and this is Orange 20. Today we're continuing our series on designing games. You can find the episode on dungeon crawling here, or you can find the episode on mysteries here. I have to make sure I remember to put those cards in, or that's going to just be real weird. Today we're talking about running a game on politics for your tabletop RPG. We're going to focus on Dungeons & Dragons as our example game, but there are certainly better systems for running a politics-based game. But even in D&D, it can be a lot of fun. And once your characters start getting to the mid-levels, I think it's actually a reward. When they start hitting about level 8 or so, they're probably having a pretty big effect on the local area. So now, the local power brokers care about them. A good adventuring party can provide a lot of strength to someone who can get them on side, and be a big threat to anyone who opposes them. When the nobles, merchant guild leaders, and priests start to recognize the strength of the characters, it really validates what they've done so far in your campaign. So if you're bringing your characters into a political game, the first thing you need to do is make sure you invest them with some sort of power. A lot of times this will just be their reputation as competent problem solvers. Alternatively, they can be empowered by some authority to negotiate on their behalf. This can be the noble family one of the characters is a member of or supports, the holy order which their paladin belongs to, the army in which they used to serve, the mage or thieves guild that they're part of. Seriously, any organization that has an effect on the local area can be the reason the characters are invited to join a political game. One of my favorite ways to enter a political game, however, is to give the player characters control over some important resource. This can be an artifact or a place they control or a prisoner they've captured. Different groups want the resource and they are trying to convince the characters to give it to them. So let's say the players have recently liberated the Temple of Foresight, an ancient cathedral from the Mayan Empire. The party doesn't want to spend the rest of their careers guarding it, so they need to determine who they will turn it over to. The Queen of Cyrus has told the players that they may decide who will be given control of the temple, and the task of keeping it safe. Because the temple contains the Pool of Tomorrow, which casts Contact Other Plane once a day, whichever group becomes the guardian gets the most access and therefore a lot of benefit in return for guarding the temple. So the Church of Mystra, the Council of Merchants, Countess Vistra, and the Earl of Torcroft all hope to be named, and they engage the party to be chosen. At this point, you'll need to decide what each group desires and how they feel about the other groups. This is often called relationship mapping. The first person I'm worried about is the Queen. I decide she's not a fan of the Council of Merchants gaining access, but she can't afford to say this outright. They control so much wealth and the noble class is starting to fail. She hopes the party won't choose them, but if they do, she will not be pleased with this decision. The Supreme Arcanist of Mystra is happy to share access with another group, as the priests and paladins may not be enough to protect the site. The chair of the Guild Council thinks the temple will lead to great fortune. He's willing to offer the character of Fortune to name the guilds as the protector. He's happy to share it with the church, but not with either of the nobles, whom he distrusts. Countess Vistra is a terribly arrogant person. Because her family used to own the lands where the temple sits, she thinks it should be returned to them. She dislikes the player characters, viewing them as violent vagrants. If the players recommend she shares the site with the church, it improves her opinion of them. If they even hint that she should join forces with the Merchants Guild, she becomes excessively hostile. The Earl of Torcroft is friendly and charismatic, but this hides the fact that he's planning a coup to overthrow the Queen. He won't share the site with anyone, because he will be using the Pool of Tomorrow to help him commit treason. His hidden goal in a lot of conversations with the characters is to see if they can be lured over to support his side in his planned civil war. You'll notice that I haven't included an opinion from each group for each other group. Torcroft's plans means he can't work with anyone. The Countess is neutral on a base level towards Torcroft, but she wants the site for herself. so she is at odds with him. Even though they're opposed, they don't dislike each other, they're just in competition. The various groups will work with the players, but part of this is to see what they can get from the group. Some, like the church, might be very straightforward about what they want. Others, like the Countess or Torcroft, may be vague to try and find out what the characters want and how far they can be trusted. A lot of times in my game, this will take the form of many different events. They'll throw parties and invite the characters, or have a banquet, or do something to honor them to decide how far they can trust those characters. It's a feeling out stage that happens in the real world all the time. So each group tries to get to know the characters a little better and decide what they can tell them, what they need to keep secret from them, and what the players want in order to give up what the faction wants. You should have a rough idea of what each faction has in order to achieve their goals. The church has priests and paladins in its service and several powerful mages among the worshippers. They can't afford much right now, and if they take over the temple, they'll be stretched pretty thin. But they can offer services down the road and access to high-level spells and mystic items potentially through their worshippers. The Merchants Guild has mercenaries and the most wealth of any of the factions competing for the temple. They may offer to buy the characters off, and if that doesn't work and they start to get nervous that the characters are going to choose someone else, they may send threats or assassins after them. The Countess has a decent-sized army and also her voice in political matters in the future. It takes a lot to convince her that the characters are upstanding individuals, and she is never going to feel that all people are equal, but she could be a powerful voice in politics in the days to come. Torcroft has his political acumen, a much larger army than anyone knows, and the cunning to manipulate the other groups, maybe making the merchants afraid and have them act against the characters. If he can't get the temple for himself, he's clever enough about the situation to push that the merchants get it, because he could later accuse them of some crime and attack taking the temple for himself, saying that the merchants were disloyal to the queen. Like when designing mysteries, you have to run this game based heavily on what the players do. You have to have a good idea about what each faction has for its resources, what they want, and you can use this to guide how they react to the players. If the players meet with the merchants first, the Countess takes offense, and may even go to the Queen and mention how they are unqualified to make this decision. If the players go to the church first, the guild may secretly approach the High Arcanist with a shared control plan. No matter what's happening, Torcroft spends as much time as possible with the characters to learn their traits, bonds, and flaws, so he can use them to get them onto his side. Each time something major happens, take a moment and consider each of your factions. What do they know right now, even if all they know is nothing has yet changed, because they haven't got news of the last event? Then think about what you want them to do next. Find out what the players want to do next. Then decide the next event likely to happen, whether it's letting the players make their next move or having one of the factions interrupt those plans with their move first. If you're uncertain on who would make the next move, I would recommend doing an initiative roll, but instead of using dex, figure out who the primary actor in each faction is and roll an initiative based off of their wisdom for how well they understand the situation. Do they know that they need to move now? And if they do, are they able to get everything in place in time? One thing to remember is that there can also be sub-factions. Maybe the Caravan Guard Guild is frustrated with how long the players are taking to make their decision, and without the chair of the Guild Council's knowledge, attacks the characters in secret to threaten them to choose the guild. Perhaps Torcroft's daughter has become suspicious of her father, and tries to warn the characters in secret. She doesn't want to be in the center of a civil war, and she's looking for allies who will help her stand up against her father, but she doesn't have any proof yet to take it to the proper authorities. If you're having trouble building your factions, I'd like to recommend the following exercise. Start by creating one faction and figure out what they want. Then, think of a faction that might specifically oppose what they want and why they want to do that. Decide what this faction does want, and then figure out who might want to oppose that faction. I generally won't introduce more than 3 or 4 factions in a single game session. After they've reached I'm going to call it a court, of 3 or 4 factions, it's okay to start adding new ones, maybe 1 or 2 per game session, but you need to make sure you're keeping good notes and recapping your players on what their past interactions were. When you can, you want to reuse one of the factions you previously introduced instead of introducing a whole new fresh one. I've been using the word faction here, but remember, this can be an individual person. I usually like to use bigger groups because I like to have sub-factions and internal strife within the factions. It's also important to keep each faction separate in your players' minds. In a politic game, I will often give the NPCs exaggerated tics or tells in the way I play them to help keep them separate. The Arcanist starts most sentences with, well, yes, but. The chair of the guild sniffs a lot. The Countess constantly has her nose in the air and is exceedingly careful with her enunciation and diction. Torcroft touches his thumb to his chin whenever he's thinking. These tics act as shorthands to help the players keep things straight. You may need to recap a bit more often in this type of game. You are individually playing a lot of different people, and they all have agendas, and none of them are telling the truth. As you recap, use phrases like, well, the Arcanist said, or Torcroft told you, or the Countess seems to believe, because you don't ever want to apply an objective truth to the situation. The factions are not telling the players the truth of the situation, what they want or what they need. You want to make sure you keep that ambiguity in place because it keeps the game moving the way you want it to. So to recap, you want to start by investing the player characters with the power they need to be actual players at some level in the local political game. Figure out what factions they are dealing with, what those factions want, and what resources they have in order to achieve their goals. You also want to figure out a few of their beginning opinions of the competing factions. After each scene, figure out what information is available to each faction, what they will do next, and then have the next scene occur and determine what this changes for everyone else's plans. Don't introduce too many factions. Work to keep them separate, but remember the value of strife within the factions. Make sure you recap regularly, but don't say this is true or this isn't true. Remind them who said what, because they need to be sorting out the lies. It's part of the fun of this game. Hey look, it's this book. If you want to support what I'm doing here, find the link down below and buy a copy, or tell someone they should buy a copy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment if you have any questions on this topic or any other topics. Thanks. Bye.
Ba 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 ba.
The Countess. The Countess. Red leather, yellow leather.